like to welcome everybody today to our program, Liberating Gaza, but Working Class Means. My name is Sandra Harris, and I am a member of Encuentro Cinco. Today's forum is being co-sponsored by the Center of Marxist Education, Boston Mayday Coalition, Encuentro Cinco, Labor Fight Back Network, and Veterans for Peace Boston, is Medley D. Butler Brigade. Our presenter today is Wadi'h Halabi, who was born in Palestine and ended up in Gaza during the ethnic cleansing of 1948. His family later moved to Egypt and finally ended up here in the United States. Our moderator today will be Soren Mutlier, who is also a member of Encuentro Cinco and will be participating from South Africa. As we speak, bombs are still exploding in Gaza, and millions worldwide are demanding an immediate ceasefire. After 26,000 deaths in Gaza with no end in sight, it is clear that the world's so-called leaders have no answers to the crisis, and it's up to us to act. And the question arises, how can working people force a ceasefire? What will that require? And how can the effort advance the liberation of all oppressed nations, as well as ending the apartheid across the historic Palestine? What working class actions are taking place today is a good question. And what are the broader possibilities for union activity and action on a world scale? Now, I would like to ask Wadi'h to pretty much start and welcome him.
Well, thank you, everybody who's been involved in building today's event and working on this question of liberation of Gaza. How did we get to this point of blatant, open mass killing of a population that has effectively, that imperialism has tried to eradicate for about 75 years, to break up the nation. What's the history behind the creation of the Israeli state? Lenin and the Comintern had a long history of opposing Zionism and its project, and showing how imperialism was exposing how it served imperialism's interest. But does the essentially world communist and union movement, but especially the communist movement, have any responsibility in terms of supporting the imperialism in creating this Israeli state? What guidance does Marx would offer us on Gaza today? Going back to history briefly, what's the history of Palestinian response and resistance to the creation of the Israeli state, the response to the Soviet and Communist Party error in supporting imperialism and creating this monster? What's this about a Beirut commune? Almost everybody's heard about the Paris Commune of 1871 when the working class took power. But a Beirut commune, most people have never even heard of it. So, and why was it defeated? The lessons that Marx and Engels and Lenin drew from the defeat of a Paris Commune were crucial to the victory of the Russian Revolution and every subsequent revolution. The picture, what we face today, seems very bleak. What's the material basis for revolutionary optimism? What would it take to turn optimism into victories and actual liberation? And how can we apply an assessment of the basis for optimism to liberating Gaza and ultimately to liberating humanity? Do we have any examples of union-backed mass mobilizations to achieve tasks? To go very briefly, in November 1917, with the almost immediate victory coming of the Russian Revolution, Britain published the Balfour Declaration. And that juxtaposition of Russian Revolution, and of course, this was World War I, which the Russian Revolution was effectively about to end, and Britain's publication of the Balfour Declaration, which said that it intended to support creating an Israeli state, are not by accident. And the historical evidence is that Britain's interest, there were two twin interests. One, almost as soon as the Ottoman Empire, which had essentially held sway in Palestine for 5 centuries, it was breaking up, and Britain secretly sent geologists to Palestine looking for oil. And so certainly, and the indications the geologists sent was that there may be an enormous amount of oil in under Palestine. But in addition, Palestine was basically a hub for transport of oil from where the center of world oil resources proved to be, which is not far away in the Arabian Peninsula. But there's another side to it. Again, the Russian Revolution. A disproportionate number of European Jews had not only supported the Russian Revolution, but often played leading roles. And so, in a sense, Britain's motivation was war. First, oil had proved how important it was in warfare, so superior to the use of coal for energy. But in addition, you control oil prices, and you can basically cheapen wages without having to reopen union negotiations. But in addition, part of the idea was to drive Jews from fighters for human liberation into becoming national oppressors. And in any event, and maybe Søren will go to what must be the second of the slides, Lenin letter to American workers. So the slide title should begin Lenin.
Slides aren't showing yet.
Okay, I'll do that in a second. And I think we should be
Oh.
okay now in terms of sharing the screen with you. This is what you had intended to show, right?
Yes, this is great. So, so again, the Balfour Declaration and the Russian Revolution are November 1917. In August of I'm sorry, I typed 2018. In August of 1918, Lenin has this tremendous letter to American workers that I highly recommend, and not least because it shows Lenin balancing the interest of the new Soviet state and the interest of world revolution. But in a letter to American workers, it contains effectively two warnings about Palestine with a negligible population, maybe not much more than 500,000 at the time. And so I'm quoting one of them here: for the sake of their cause, that is, for the sake of winning world hegemony, the imperialists of Britain and Germany have not hesitated to utterly ruin and throttle a whole number of countries: Belgium and Serbia, Palestine and Mesopotamia, Iraq. And then essentially he's warning the world communist movement, or at the time maybe socialist movement, must they place, this is essentially, he's talking about socialists, or place the integrity and security of their bourgeois created fatherland above the interests of world socialist revolution. And he talks about essentially we do not respect the borders of essentially the capitalist world, and not least this applies to the United States with its commitment to control the entire continent of North America, manifest destiny. What essentially the North, what the Civil War above all for, is to control the borders of what became the United States. So there was a long warning. Lenin had fought against the Zionism, including the seemingly socialist forms of Zionism. The Bund fought them tooth and nail, and again warned about what imperialism's plans were for Palestine. So if we can go to the second slide, Søren, it's the one that starts Comintern. So not quite in the order, but maybe you can pick it up.
Yes, one moment.
Okay.
Oops, sorry.
So here it is. This is from the Communist International's magazine, November 1937. One of the last issues, that I believe, of the magazine. And you see, against the British plan to divide Palestine. The article is by William Gallagher, member of parliament. He was called the Communist MP. And this goes on for quite a few pages, warning about what a disaster it would be, creation of the Israeli state. By 1943, however, under tremendous pressure from imperialism, the Soviet leadership dissolved the Communist International. And the indications are fairly consistent that in August 1945, Soviet leaders secretly agreed to support imperialism in creating the Israeli state. Now, considering capitalism's crimes, wasn't just Hitler, wasn't just the Nazis, world capitalism's crimes against not only Jews, but also against Romans and the Sinti people of Europe. There was justification for forming a refuge for Romans and Sinti and refuge for Jews in the West, not in Palestine. But essentially what Soviet leaders agreed to support the United States in creating this monster. And one of the first actions, and one of the least known, is that the first ethnic cleansing necessary to create the Israeli state wasn't of Palestinians, what I was part of. It was carried out by the US Army, and it was cleansing a significant portion of Jews still living in Europe and forcing them to go to Palestine, shutting the door on Jews being able to migrate to the United States, where most of them wanted to go, and forcing them to go into Palestine. And this increased the population of Jews in Palestine, I would say, by more than 40%. A single action where the US Army essentially placed about 250,000 Jews, maybe slightly more, on ships and carried them into Palestine. And that was huge. In some ways, though, and we can understand why imperialism would do this. Far, far more serious is that Soviet leaders arranged essentially for the arming and training of Zionist bands, including providing them with planes used to bomb civilians and carry out the second ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Of course, this was 100% reversal from the position of Lenin and of the Communist International. And that Soviet arming and training of Zionist bands actually was crucial to the creation of the Israeli state. The United States was very busy basically trying to prevent advance of communism in Europe above all, but also to address revolutions in Vietnam, Korea, and above all China. And so that Soviet aid played a crucial role. Again, the Soviet agreement was very early in this period and did a massive amount of damage in terms of because it disoriented the entire communist movement. So let's go a third slide if we could, and that's what would Marx, the one says,
yes, key points of
maybe in
guidance.
the very first. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and also remind you that you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So, but basically I'm reading from this. So what guidance on Gaza would Marx provide us today? And first is the whip of reaction urges the revolution on. By this he means that when something as terrible as what's unfolding in Gaza happens, that actually can spur international working class unity to stop the massacre and to move to real solutions. And the resulting labor unity and strength can have other applications. Ukraine, Congo, in my opinion, what's going on in Congo or Central African Republic is even worse than what's unfolding in Gaza, because it's not as obvious what the forces are behind the massacre. And then there's question of healthy food and clean water, the housing crisis that's hitting youth so badly, the environment. Second of Marx's advice is, we're not fighting to force the bosses to give us what we need. We're fighting so the working class can take what it needs. And workers' needs include liberation of all oppressed nations and land reform, breaking the lingering history, essentially from feudalism, of private land ownership and speculation. So then the call for ceasefire by working class means differs sharply from calls for ceasefire now, which are intended to pressure the powers that be. And the third is workers of the world unite. And what does that involve in practice? The call for ceasefire by working class means points to the need for the world communist and union movement to organize internationally coordinated mass mobilizations backed by labor actions to stop the production, flow, and use of arms on the people of Gaza, and to liberate Gaza and enforce Palestinian refugees' right to return. And let's go to the one more slide on the Beirut Commune. So that may be the last of the, yep. So Palestinian resistance first went from nationalism after essentially that Soviet betrayal. So one of the first things I learned as a 5-year-old was that the communists had supported the creation of this monster. And I knew as a 5-year-old and know now that injustice, that was a real crime, that injustices like that would not stand. But after the massive defeat in the 1967 war, essentially the best of Palestinian nationalists moved to Marxism that incorporated the task for national liberation, but goes much broader. And the motivation behind that essentially was the considerable successes of achievements, not least of the Vietnamese, essentially communist-led forces in resisting and then ultimately defeating the United States. I went to Vietnam in 1967. Income per person was about $300 per person in Vietnam, and they could defeat mighty U.S. imperialism, to be sure, with the help of actually the Soviet Union and China. So Palestinian movement moved from nationalism to Marxism, and after the 67 war, by 1970, essentially the working class was in a position to challenge for power in Jordan. That gives you an idea of a speed that things can happen at. That was defeated. Some Soviets were formed in Jordan in 70. It was drowned in blood with the cooperation, essentially, of all bourgeois regimes, no matter how radical, passive or and active cooperation to defeat the working class in Jordan. The Palestinian leadership was able to move to Lebanon, and that coincided with radicalization of the working class and the rise of workers. One I'll never forget is women workers at the Gandour chocolate. I lived in Lebanon and was there part of the time. Rose up against the bosses. And before we knew it, despite constant Israeli attacks with the cooperation of the Lebanese army, essentially workers, the working class forces, often called the rejection front, rejection of two-state, in favor of liberation of all of Palestine, secular, democratic Palestine, first defeated the Lebanese army, and then the last remaining force upholding campus power in Lebanon was was a phalange, open admirers of Hitler, armed and trained by the Israelis. And in any event, after the defeat of the phalange, no armed power stood in the way of the working class essentially taking power in Lebanon. The United States, the Israelis ready to pounce. The United States said, don't you dare, and arranged for the Palestine Liberation Army, the bourgeois side of the Palestinian movement, headquartered in Syria, to come in. Within weeks, the Palestine Liberation Army, the masses were confused, but within weeks, the Palestinian Liberation Army was defeated. And again, no armed power stood in the way of the working class taking power. And the leadership, mainly political leadership, mainly coming from Palestinian side, but appealed to Soviet leaders effectively to support creation of a Cuba in Lebanon, except Lebanon is not an island, and almost certainly the fires of revolution would have spread to Syria, probably to Turkey, NATO country, and inevitably to Iran, which in fact had revolution break out. But the Soviet leadership refused to support socialist revolution in Lebanon. And the United States again told the Israelis not to come in and arrange for the Syrian army, armed and trained by the Soviets, to come into Lebanon and to reestablish bourgeois power. And they did it half-heartedly. The Syrian regime was kind of mildly social democratic, and the 1982 invasion by the Israelis was to finish the job that the Syrian army started but did not quite finish. And that's what the massacres in the refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, near the airport in Lebanon, was about. It was to finish a job. But basically what we have then is the rise of fundamentalism follows the defeat of the Beirut Commune. So let me stop at that and let's take it from there, Søren. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wadi'h. I have a few questions based on what you've said right now, and also based on some questions that John had shared with me. So I'd like to go back so that we can revisit some of the key points you made, and perhaps clarify them. You know, when we look back, say, to 1976, we're looking back 50 or so years. And the context, the international context, you know, is not as clear. Could you say a little bit more about the bourgeois regimes? Are you talking about Ba'athist regimes surrounding Lebanon, surrounding what was Jordan of that time?
So you must be speaking about 1970. So when the working class attempted to take power, or was moving towards taking power in Jordan in 1970, and again Syria and Iraq, much more radical regime, and basically, essentially, actively and passively, by blocking movement, by actually use of arms, effectively moved to paralyze or even directly attack the working class forces in Jordan. And the leadership was not sufficiently developed. The working class hadn't developed enough strength politically, organizationally, militarily, to win, and it was drowned in blood. That's what is often known as Black September. So that was the first attempt, and my father's youngest brother, who had been was not that much older than me and had been wounded in the head in the 1948 Nakba. At the start of 1970, he was the Israeli plane targeted him and killed him while he was driving his car. It turned out that the Jordanian army had told the Israelis where he was, where he would be. And so the rocket that killed him entered my head, because if this was no Arab-Israeli war, here the working class was moving to challenge the exploiters for power, and class comes first. The drive to exploit overwhelms others. So as much as national oppression was an issue, as soon as the working class rose to challenge for power, look at the response. And again, all of the bourgeois regimes were involved. So actually, there was one more slide, the Beirut Commune slide. It's worth showing because the war was depicted as a war between Christians and Muslims. And this was repeated. So this is a civil war in Lebanon from April 1975 to June 76, depicted in all bourgeois newspapers, but unfortunately in working class papers, as a war between Christians and Muslims. But this is one of the best defined class wars that I know of since World War II, where workers of all nationalities and all religions were came over to the side of the working class. And on the other hand, the exploiters from all religions and all were involved in terms of trying to protect bourgeois rule. So if you can go to that slide, it's an exceptional admission from the imperialists that something extraordinary happened. So very short. It's but
Okay.
this comes from the Hoover institutions. The Hoover Institute kept track of what was going on in the world communist movement until the Soviet Union collapsed, and then they stopped. Look at this. Beirut Commune of 76, anti-communists were more class conscious than our world movement. I'm quoting, in 1976, the Civil War presented the Lebanese leftists, including the communists, with a brief opportunity for setting up a possibly Soviet-oriented government. The USSR, however, appears to have hesitated in sponsoring a People's Democratic Republic of Lebanon. And this is just a few months after the last time the working class has taken power in the world, almost 50 years ago. That's in December 1975, the working class took power in Laos and formed the People's Democratic Republic of Laos. And what's followed, unfortunately, in many ways, is 50 years of defeats, including defeat of what should have been socialist revolution, not just in Lebanon, in Iran 3 years later. And a victory in Iran would have immensely weakened imperialism and would have strengthened the Soviet Union and Soviet workers and the world working class. And again, the Soviet leadership refused to support the working class taking power in Iran, where many people don't realize Iranian workers formed Soviets in Iran. Not only did they seize oil fields, oil refineries, and factories, but they formed Soviets. Third time they formed Soviets in the 20th century. 1917, again after World War II, and again in 1979. and the clergy would not could not break the Soviets. The U.S. supported Iraqi war on Iran was intended to break up the Soviets. It's one of the bloodiest wars that many people are not aware of, with the U.S. providing day-to-day satellite information and weaponry to the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein. And the intent was to break up the power of the workers in Iran. So it's from these lessons that essentially I've tried to draw the conclusions leading to liberation of Gaza by working class means.
Thank you, Wadi'h. I do notice, however, that there are other hands up, and I would like to just remind people of our agenda. After I ask some questions, then Sandra will look at the chat and see which questions come up there. And we encourage all of you to post your questions or observations and comments there. Once Sandra gets a few comments, Sandra will present these questions to Wadi'h, who will address them, and then we'll go back to take more questions. So by way of asking my second question, it leads also to a third question. How did the Palestinian leadership or working class Palestinian organizations respond to these, what appear to me to be betrayals by the Soviet leadership? And to provide some context for that, Cuba, at the same time that we're talking about 1976, had to push the Soviet Union in order to confront the apartheid state in Angola. They succeeded in doing that. They also succeeded in deepening the Ethiopian revolution in that period. Why was there this difference with regard to Palestine? So it's a two-part question: Palestinian responses to betrayal, and also the reasons for these betrayals, where there were also advances in some other geopolitical areas.
So that's again starting with the deep Soviet error in supporting imperialism and creating the Israeli state. Part of a response was to move to nationalism, and there had been a significant, not huge, but significant, essentially working class leadership, Palestinian and including Jews living in Palestine. But with that deep Soviet error, many Jews in the Communist Party in Palestine aided the Zionists. And the response, of course, was to divide the workers. And the response then was nationalism. Part of it coming from like the Muslim Brotherhood. So Arafat came out of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, but nevertheless, there was resistance, but not on a working class, not on an international basis. And that happens again after the Soviet after the Soviet leadership turned its back on what should have been a done deal revolution in Lebanon in '76. So, except now it takes the form of pretty radical fundamentalist movements. One of the most remarkable, which learned a lot militarily from the working class struggle in Lebanon during that heroic 75-76 period, is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah in Lebanon did an extraordinary job in terms of really almost routing the Israeli army in the invasion of 2006. Extraordinary and remarkable ethics, again, picked up for an army, picked up from the working class struggle in 75, 76. But Hezbollah, in many ways, is a narrow, nationalist, petty bourgeois force. So at the same time that it was, that essentially drove the Israelis out in 2006, a defeat that they still, you know, until the resistance they're facing now. At the same time, Palestinians in Lebanon faced conditions worse than they had ever seen. And so we have that side of a force, petty bourgeois force, basically resisting imperialism and its servant, and yet ignoring the conditions that Palestinians were suffering in Lebanon, never mind in Syria next door. And this has spread, of course. So not only Hamas, but other fundamentalist groups. And often, again, they represent a petty bourgeois resistance to what imperialism is doing across, but unable to develop solutions like the solutions that the Chinese Revolution brought about, which has brought 800 million people out of extreme poverty. Solutions like in Vietnam, in Cuba. So the working class is able to make achievements that the bourgeoisie simply can't. And of course, the fundamentalists were easily used by imperialism, essentially, to tear apart the Soviet army in Afghanistan. And as ostensibly anti-American as the clergy was in Iran, they cooperated with the United States in essentially defeating the Soviet army in Afghanistan. So hopefully that answers. This is where the fundamentalist movement comes from, and the key development. Essentially, it's the weaknesses and errors of the world working class movement.
Okay. Thank you, Wadi'h. Rather than asking you my third full question, I'm going to turn to Sandra because there have been a number of questions and comments and observations in the chat. And Sandra, would you like to ask these questions now, take 2 or 3? And I know that the Center for Marxist Education has their hand raised. If you could just enter that question into the chat or message me about it. In the meantime, Sandra.
Yes, thank you, Soren, and thank you, Wadi'h. Very important information here that make us understand better the concept. And there have been a couple comments. Padma workers have in solidarity with Palestine. Socialist Party in Palestine, if the answer is negative, why not? That will be the first question. No. And also, I would like to remind you, if you want to keep in touch and be part of this in-depth conversation, you can enter your email in the chat. We'll have your information and we'll send you notifications for future presentations. Okay, I think that's pretty much the question that I have now.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So, Wadi'h, if you were to address that question directly, have there been socialist parties in Palestine? If not, why not?
There have been, there are, but this because the one who was in power in the first 3 decades almost in the Israeli state were ostensibly socialists. socialist Zionists, exactly who Lenin had fought against. But in terms of the communist movement, it's effectively totally confused, divided, and unable to provide any leadership. Let me put it this way. The implication of having the Soviet Union and having communist parties support the creation of the Israeli state, the implication was that communists were supporting national oppression instead of national liberation, and supporting seizing land from the tiller and handing it over to an agent of Wall Street. Can you imagine what effect that has on the communist movement, not only across the Middle East, but across most of Africa? South Africa was the major exception. To this day, other than South Africa, essentially the communist movement just devastated. This error still has not been corrected. And so the harsh answer, as much as people have tried, effectively there's a need for the world movement to correct this. And in part, this is where this proposal for ceasefire by working class means, liberating Gaza by working class means comes from, is a move to begin to correct an error. And it is intended not only to liberate essentially the people of Gaza, but to liberate essentially the world movement from the Soviet era, still not corrected. And actually, a lot of the work I've done is what were the decisive weaknesses behind the collapse of the Soviet Union and other major defeats, including defeat of the Beirut Commune, the defeat of the Iranian, what should have been socialist revolution in Iran. And a lot of this owes to years of discussion with Richard Levins, who played quite a role or often spoke at E5. So, again, to take from Marx's guidance on Gaza, the whip of reaction can urge the revolution on. And of course, what's unfolding in Gaza, the press is reporting essentially there are about 150 deaths per day from bombing, and 25,000 deaths to date, maybe 250 to 300 deaths a day since October 7 from bombing. The reality in terms of Gaza is that there is very likely to be 1,500, maybe 2,000 deaths per day, primarily of children under 5, in maternal mortality, and the most vulnerable in general. From what? From air pollution, from bombing, and from the use of smoke bombs, which most people haven't heard about, but that the Israelis use to force an enormous amount of the population from one area to another, used at night. From poisoning of the water, which was severe before October 7th and far more severe. And the water's been poisoned deliberately and passively it's filled with sewage, bad enough. It's filled with fertilizer runoff. Above all, seawater. The salt in the water is toxic. And again, so the deaths, the real deaths, and that are ignored. So then there's the hunger, then there's extreme homelessness, there's the destruction of what little health system there was. So again, deaths could easily be 500,000 of the population of Palestine in the coming year. And the public health experts that I've seen have not taken into account the most immediate of the stresses, which is the air pollution. And I forgot where I'm going.
Okay,
Søren, you have to forgive me.
no, thank you. It's not easy to lose track in this genocidal fog that is before us. And so I can see how you'd readily make a journey from the 1970s to the moment of the present. Thank you, Wadi'h. There are some questions that are still in the chat, but in addition, I know that you had prepared to talk a little bit more about contemporary labor solidarity and how that will help correct the mistakes of the past, the mistakes of the workers' movement. Did you want to say a little bit about that? I know that there are many participating members of the audience of this conversation who might be able to talk also about a little bit about some of the labor organizations and their responses.
Thank you. So if we could go to the second slide, the one that says Oakland in it.
Okay.
Because that's part of the inspiration behind the call, first for liberation of Gaza by working class means, and then since October 7th, ceasefire by working class means. So if we can go to that slide, it should say Oakland.
Okay, it should be on.
Yes, it is. Oh, this makes me so happy. So again, this is part of so this is basically in support of the people of Gaza. This was after bombing of Gaza in 2021. So the Longshore Workers Union on the West Coast, essentially, where the Communist Party played a huge role in forming this union in the 1930s. And it has remained extraordinary, taking on extraordinary struggles where these workers risked their jobs and their livelihoods in support of struggles, and that included on Palestine. What's especially significant with this, so this is from the Oakland Side newspaper. Pro-Palestine ship blockade is the latest chapter in Port of Oakland's activist history. And it mentions the unionized longshore workers. No need to go any further, just that top page with this wonderful picture. So this was an example of a combination of action by unions to block Israeli cargo shipping with mass mobilization. And apparently thousands showed up for this action. Repeated, I think just 2 weeks ago, at the same Oakland port, again in support of the people of Gaza. I still don't have all of the details of that action, but long before October 7, we did form essentially labor committee to liberate Gaza by working class means, and really have to give credit first. There was John Lambiase, president of UE Midwest, which includes that huge GE locomotive factory, elected and re-elected as president till a stroke forced him to step back. And John unfortunately died 2 weeks ago after playing a very active role. 3 weeks ago now. Yeah, 3 weeks ago. Also, Mary McGinn, John's spouse and a collaborator for many, many years, also from UE. And Sandy Eaton, longtime labor activist in the Boston area, and from Mass Nurses Association, and much more. And my own wife and comrade Sandy Rosen, and what as a group, what we were doing were essentially moving to expand on actions like this. So work I had been doing on the material basis for revolutionary optimism was identified, in particular, the unions formed or transformed around the world by the communist movement in the 2 decades after the Russian Revolution. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, and more than 30 years have passed since that collapse, the unions formed or transformed by the communist parties there are more than 420 million workers in these unions. Enough is essentially to paralyze the capitalists. Are they doing it? They're not. But actions like the one in Oakland and quite a few others around the world by unions in Belgium, by unions in Italy, I believe some unions in India and elsewhere, in support of the Palestinian struggle and against imperialism and its local servants, not only the Israeli army, but the Egyptian army. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to see if we can expand actions like those longshore workers in Oakland to develop coordinated mass mobilizations backed by union actions to stop the production or transport or the hardest use of arms against Palestinians. And the most important of the agents that can advance this is the World Federation of Trade Unions, which includes unions in Vietnam, in Cuba. They're not about to move themselves, but it also includes unions in South Africa, in Brazil, in India, and quite a few other capitalist countries. And essentially, again, the idea is to try to organize coordinated mass mobilizations intended that are backed by unions.
One moment, please.
So,
I'm going to ask Padma to mute. Okay, go ahead.
In any event, as with October 7, essentially the move then goes to ceasefire by working class means. And how does that differ, say, from the step forward by many unions calling for ceasefire around the world? Is that, again, taking from Marx, the guidance Marx gives, we're not fighting to force the capitalists to give us what we need, and we do need a stop to the bombing and destruction. We're fighting so workers can take what we need. And because leave it to Biden, who has one of his agents in Europe now trying to push ceasefire, they're scared. Effectively, a move to block production or flow or use of arms against the people of Gaza is different if the working class is carrying it out. But second is many people, including many ordinary people, would like a ceasefire, if only to return to the seeming peace in the Middle East before October 7th. But Gaza was uninhabitable long before October 7th, if only because the water was poisoned. But basically, it was a concentration camp holding 2.2 million people, including infants, based on ethnicity. And believe me, the 36,000 Palestinians who approached the inner fence of Gaza were killed or wounded in 2018, 2019, in the great marches of return, often killed by snipers. That included killing of 46 children. And, you know, with a sniper sight scope, you can see individual eyelashes. The snipers killed 46 children, 700 more Palestinians, 36,000 wounded. And the snipers often, when they weren't killing, were aiming to maim. They were aiming at the spine. Gaza was an uninhabitable concentration camp where people were held on the basis of ethnicity, but uninhabitable not only because it was tight-sealed, but that poisoning of the water and destruction. So the water, it's poisoning of agricultural as well as drinking water, and that the seawater infiltration is irreversible. It's toxic, and but in any event, so not only is it a call for the working class to stop the firing, but it's also a call then for the working class to enforce Palestinian refugee right to return, which ostensibly is upheld in international law and ignored for 75 years. In fact, the British promised it in 1917 that Palestinians could, you know, have their own state and so on, refused. But so one, the right to return. The other thing is, and I think it may ring a positive response here, not only right of refugees to return to their land and homes, but an end to the apartheid, often 100% apartheid that's practiced in the Israeli state. So any new housing is absolutely 100% segregated, and this, you know, so again, that's a big difference between a call for ceasefire and what the working class needs. And the working class needs national liberation, and it needs this question of land reform. And that would be a step in terms of correcting that huge Soviet error dating back from August 45.
Thank you, Wadi'h. I'd like to go back to some of the questions that are in the chat. Unfortunately, an urgent matter has taken Sandra out of our conversation, and so what I'd like to do then is ask people who've made comments in the chat to ask their own questions. I wonder if we can start with Jose Alaman. You were asked two unanswered questions. Do you want to address them directly to Wadi'h, Jose?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Wadi'h, for bringing the issue of working class struggles from history as clues to perhaps support this opportunity. And I was typing a comment that you, citing Marx, said that this is at these times of crisis that we can react and do a better job than we have done in a century. Because if there is something that we need to do is to learn from our own mistakes. I heard you pounding on the Soviet Union, and I was saying with my eyes almost looking down, yes, yes, yes. But here we are, we have this new chance to do a better job. My last comment, and thank you, Suren, was about how mass mobilizations by labor unions in the United States won't happen. And I don't want to deliver bad news because, and I belong to one union, a teachers union. We are more concerned about our contracts and our benefits. And we even passed resolutions about, and by the way, let's stay away from this for whatever happens in Palestine, whatever happens in other unions. And so if we don't show some solidarity, if we don't start by ourselves, bringing the issue over and over, because I think, as Marx said, as you quote, it is at this time when we can do a better job in learning by our own mistakes. That's my comment. Thank you. Thank you, Wadi'h. Thank you, Suren.
Thanks, Jose.
Yeah.
Wadi'h, do you want to respond, or would you like to take another question and then respond to both Jose and the next question?
So this is a huge question.
Go for it.
I'm blocking on his name. There's a deeply anti-communist historian of the Russian Revolution. He was at Notre Dame. I don't know.
Richard Pipes?
No, it's a name that didn't ring a bell to me. But again, deeply anti-communist. And yet in his history of the Russian Revolution, he admits that what made possible the victory of a Russian Revolution was the insecurity of life under capitalism. At the time, the insecurity appeared to be individual. Will I have a roof over my head? Will I be able to feed my family? It seemed to be disparate. Of course, it was a systemic insecurity. Not only do we have that now, and on a massive scale for youth in particular, but in general for the population in terms of the housing crisis, but we have existential insecurity in terms of, the most obvious is climate, but the far more serious one actually is the destruction of biodiversity, an extraordinary decline, say, in the number of insects and now birds around the world, reflecting a breakdown underneath. For now, agricultural production seems to be continuing, but various experiments show reduce biodiversity, nothing happens, reduce biodiversity some more, nothing happens, and at some point, production collapses. The web of life has been torn apart, and it's infinitely more complex and possibly more immediate threat then. So we have that. We have the insecurity from war. We have the insecurity where suddenly prices, not least for housing, for food, just spin out of control, that we have no control. We have insecurity, like has struck very close to my heart. In 2011, Syria went from seemingly as normal as Boston today. Essentially, the place disintegrated. My name means from Aleppo, which in our family, I'm Palestinian, but in our family, Aleppo supposedly is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. I don't know if it's even true. It probably isn't, but that's our claim to fame. And in 2011, Aleppo begins, and all of Syria begins a disintegration. It's now been 13 years. It'd be 13 years in March and so my sister ended up in Libya. Also, March 2011, the U.S. threw a match into Libya. Libya has disintegrated. But Congo effectively disintegrated about the time that the Soviet Union disintegrated. And conditions in Congo are unspeakable, and probably next door Central African Republic even worse. We have this powerful thrust potentially favoring revolution, as with who favored revolution in Russia in 1917. But the other side of this is, again, what's the material basis for revolutionary optimism? It's these past achievements of the working class. And they include Marxism, which allows us not only to properly evaluate reality. What's happening in Gaza just reflects basically the decay of capitalism and its growing weakness, above all, the growing weakness of the United States. But there's this tremendous accomplishment of the working class, which include revolution, which include development of a world communist movement. It's not effective right now, but it's around. There's an organization most people probably have never heard of, SolidNet, that brings together, I think it's now 124 communist parties whose reference points are the theory and practice, the theory, organization, and practice that made possible the Russian Revolution, the victory of a Russian Revolution, of a Chinese Revolution. These parties, between them, have about 112 members, 112 million members. There's the unions formed or transformed by the Communist Party, reflected in a small way what happened in Oakland 2 years ago, and again 2 weeks ago, and in Oakland, I think again in 2014. And then there's certain ways of organizing, there's certain ways of education. There's tremendous accomplishments like the ecological agriculture developed in Cuba, which points to methods to achieve social and environmental sustainability. In any event, these past accomplishments need to be mobilized to complete the job. And the fantastic insecurity of life under capitalism can be a huge force supporting it, but that those past accomplishments on a world scale need to be mobilized, and that's partially behind the call for liberation of Gaza by working class means, ceasefire by working class means.
Thanks, Wadi'h. So I'm going to go to two other people who have their hands up. First, our comrades from the Center for Marxist Education, and then on to Joan. The Center for Marxist Education, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or share a comment with Wadi'h and the rest?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, okay. No, some comments on the, let's see, I followed the events in Lebanon from Turkey, from radio broadcasts and newspapers quite. I think there was a debate who controlled the PLA, and I think the Syrian government army was controlling it when it was sent to Lebanon. It was sort of a soft guise of Syrian intervention. Yeah, but Syria did initially support the Jordanian uprising under Salah Jadid, but Assad refused to provide Air Force cover and then overthrew Salah Jadid. Salah Jadid was quite radical. And as far as I know, one of the reasons why poor leadership in Palestine in 1948, I think it's blamed usually due to the defeat of 1938 revolt, where many of the best leaders were executed by the British. So would you confirm that?
Yeah, the 36th uprising, but the killings took place in 38. So there was a great Palestinian uprising in 38, that began in 1936, and with the support of the Communist Party, but not its leadership. The leadership, in part, was feudal, the Husseini family, but nevertheless, significant working class participation, not least refinery workers in Haifa, some of them Arab and some Jewish, but that is correct. In terms of PLA, Palestine Liberation Army, being called in January of 1976, after effectively the defeat of the last force holding up bourgeois power in Lebanon, the Phalange, with Israeli support. Yes, funded by the Syrians, and it was working out of Syria. But believe me, the PLO had quite a hand in it. It wouldn't have been possible. What was amazing is how quickly it fell apart along class lines, as did the Lebanese army. It just fell apart. But yes, it was sent basically to try to prop up bourgeois power after the defeat of the Phalange. And yes, it never would have happened without the Syrian supporting it. As soon as effectively the working class moved towards taking power in Jordan in 1970, yes, effectively even the most radical leaders, if they failed to act to prevent the working class taking power, the rest of the bourgeois state moved to do it, and moved to stop that development. So in some ways, the Iraqi Ba'athi regime was the stronger, more radical one than in Syria. And again, passively or actively, they all ultimately, all bourgeois forces made sure about the defeat in Jordan in 1970.
Thanks, Wadi'h. I want to ask you a question that actually came out of the chat, but seems particularly pertinent at this moment. When the PFLP was formed in 1967, it represented a combination of radical nationalism with at least an aspiring socialist vision. Where would you put them in your typology of movements? This was a question that came from AJ. How do you evaluate the PFLP leadership, given that they affiliated with the PLO, although of course were not Fatah by any means?
Extraordinary, absolutely remarkable, and moved very rapidly to Marxism, with quite a bit of, understandably, I would say, initially ultra-leftism that was then including hijacking of planes, but then this is tempered first by revolution, essentially drowned in blood in Jordan. But nevertheless, the working class keeps developing and expressing itself. That leadership was able to move to Lebanon, as did the DFLP is split from the PFLP, which in many ways was more classical Marxist, and in many ways was sometimes called the Palestinian Communist Party, so often associated with the world pro-Soviet communist movement. In reaction to this development, imperialism starts floating again, two-state solution. And there's quite a test promising, you know, this is Kissinger and so on. This is in the face of working class radicalization, not least in Lebanon. So it's around 1973. And unfortunately, DFLP, Democratic Front, which in many ways had more solid, follows the Soviet and most CPs in supporting two-state, this trap set by imperialism. And PFLP, Habash, to its credit, exposes the two-state as basically little more than promising a South African solution, the Bantustan, and this was a trap. And so then PFLP is essentially who's providing the political leadership and guidance to civil war in Lebanon, to the working class side in Lebanon. Absolutely remarkable. And to its credit, say the Communist Party in Lebanon, which was also supported two-state, handled itself honorably, wasn't in the leadership, but handled itself honorably through the civil war in Lebanon. But here it is, almost 50 years since May, June of 1976 and defeat of the Beirut Commune. It's really Lebanon Commune. I use Beirut Commune provocatively because of the importance of the Paris Commune. But really the working class took power effectively across Lebanon. But after the defeat of 1976, PFLP is still around. 75,000 people filled the stadium in Gaza. I think it may have been for its 40th or 50th anniversary, 2007 or sometime around then. But it's still handling itself honorably. But after a defeat like it suffered in Lebanon, or specifically first in Jordan, but above all in Lebanon, coming so close, actually in a position of power, and being defeated like that with the world movement ignoring it or helping with its defeat. It's not in a position to take leadership, and really, in part, it's for the world movement. Again, there's such a problem of decay in capitalist countries that we have to gather up all of our forces, and above all, those in where communist parties are in power, and to move to complete humanity's liberation from capitalism. But hopefully that's some answer on PFLP.
Thank you, Wadi'h. Joan has her hand up, and I just want to say again, thank you for reintroducing this generation to the PFLP. Joan?
And you're muted, Joan. Maybe she gave up on us.
Okay.
I hope not.
Okay, in that case, given that we have a few minutes left, I'm going to turn to Sandra to close us out and share an important announcement. Sandra, you're up.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Okay, yes. So if there are no more questions, I would like to make an announcement. I would like to share with you all in the chat. It's going to be an invite from our Peña. Encuentro 5 host Peña every second Saturday of the month. And then because this month normally is like a Black History Month, we try to connect two very important points, not just the Gaza, but also the solidarity the African Americans and Africa in general has had with Palestine. So because of that, we would love to invite you to our February Peña, which is going to be held on February 10th at CCB, that is located at 565 Boylston Street, from 7 p.m. on. You are more than welcome to bring any music, poetry, paint, stories, whatever you want to share, because that is really what creates our peñas unique, make us feel participant of something. So thank you. There is the document in the chat as well that Soren was just sharing.
Hey.
Okay. Last call for questions. Okay, John, I guess, sorry.
Yes, I don't really have a question so much as I would like everyone to put their email in the chat so that the organizations that sponsored this forum can keep in touch with folks, and so we can continue to, share together in programs coming up in the future. But I also want to thank Wadi'h and everyone else for contributing to this program. By the way, I'm a member of the Boston May Day Coalition, one of the sponsors. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you everybody for sharing your afternoon with us, sharing your knowledge, and keep in mind that we never should stop talking about Palestine. Thank you.
I have a few people to thank myself,
besides
all of you who put up with this. One is Nellie Hester Bailey, who heads the Harlem Tenants Association, a position that Harry Haywood held decades ago, and she's been one of the strongest supporters, and that support again the identification between the Black and Palestinian liberation struggle runs deep. We sense that we face the same enemy. And in many ways, of course, the Black liberation struggle is up against most immediately this enemy. But they're all the national struggles in the United States. Wadi'h Halabi, who has supported this and who's been in the New York Times and elsewhere for after Indiana University blocked an art show that was due to start and that had worked on for decades. And she's turning against the. There's Al Sargis, who who organized the China Study Group out of the Center for Marxist Education. He's in Oakland now, and some of the information on Oakland I have, and he took Sandy and myself personally to tour the port in Oakland when I spoke there about 7 years ago. And then there are many comrades in China at the Academy of Marxism and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and they've hosted me over 25 years. And a lot of essentially the work towards understanding, identifying the weaknesses that have led to the Gaza horror, to the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. A lot of that is thanks to discussions. So there are things going on in China that we don't readily see, but there's a very significant part of the Communist Party in China that's really committed to liberation of humanity. And mind you, the main reason they've put up with me for almost 25 years now is that they want to avoid suffering the fate of the Soviet Union, and there's reason for cautious optimism. So again, thank you all, and everyone who organized this, John Harris, but Yusuf, but also Surin and Sandra. Thank you so much, and hope to see you again.
Thank you, Wadi'h. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye.